Mount Shasta lies in Northern California and has a long history of strange events. There are stories of UFOs circling the mountains and even of ancient beings living underneath it. It's an odd place, but the natural beauty continues to attract visitors to this day. Carl Herbert Landers, who was 69 years old at the time of his disappearance, had led an active and healthy life. He worked as an engineer for many years, though he transitioned to HVAC sales before eventually retiring. He resided with his family in an upscale part of Oneida, California, which is just east of San Francisco. Every morning he went for a run, as was his habit for 30 years. Eventually took part in the Boston Marathon, where he achieved a time of 5.5 hours. As he got older, his focus shifted to hiking and climbing. He made it his mission to climb every major peak in California. In 1998, he attempted to climb Mount Shasta. He didn't make it all the way up to the top, but he would return the following year to try again. He met with 2 other climbing enthusiasts at his local running club: Barry Gilmore, a 70-year-old retired pilot, and Milt Gaines, also an older gentleman who ran a wholesale warehouse in San Francisco. Carl heard that his 2 running acquaintances would be attempting the climb of Mount Shasta and asked if he could join them. They readily agreed. Barry regarded Carl as someone who enjoyed athletic challenges and was pleasant enough to be around. He stated that Carl wasn't exactly an outstanding athlete because he didn't really excel at any of the activities that they had done together, such as scuba diving and skiing, but he was a good runner and in good shape. At about 4 a.m. on Tuesday, May 24th, 1999, the trio set out from a nearby motel to Bunny Flat on Mount Shasta. They went over their gear: ice axes, crampons, cold weather gear, and so on. Everything looked good, so they set out. As they hiked, they noted that the snowdrifts were around 10 to 12 feet at the start of the climb. They decided to make the trek to Horse Camp, which is where an old cabin would be where they could take some rest. This was partially because Carl was taking a medication called Diamox, which would help him with altitude sickness, but was having some unpleasant side effects on Carl's stomach. A short time into the hike, Carl had to stop behind a tree as he felt a sudden and urgent need to use nature's bathroom. He complained of suffering from a bout of diarrhea, but they were able to continue on nevertheless. The 3 men eventually made it to the camping spot called 50/50. This is a well-known stopping point for climbers to spend the night before pushing on to climb to the top of Mount Shasta the following day. During the night, Carl once again had to excuse himself from the tent as he could feel another bout of diarrhea coming on. Other than that, the night was normal. In the early morning of the next day, the wind had picked up to approximately 70 miles per hour, and it was rattling the tent badly. The 3 men observed other hikers who had made it to the campsite packing up and heading back down the mountain, presumably due to the adverse weather. The trio decided to hunker down rather than leave, since their tent was positioned in a way that blocked the worst of the wind. After a few hours, their patience was rewarded, and the wind abated. Still uncertain if they would make the climb all the way to the summit, they decided to at least head up a little way to Lake Helen to see what the weather was like. Barry and Milt set about packing up, but noticed that Carl was just staring off into space. He appeared to be cold. Wanting to go easy on Carl, Milt told him that he and Barry would finish packing up on their own, and Carl could go on ahead without them. They would meet him there as soon as they were done, and the walk was only a few hundred feet. A little less than 30 minutes later, Milt and Barry finished packing and set out to meet Carl. About halfway to Lake Helen, though, Barry told Milt that he wasn't feeling very well, and he was going to head back down to 50/50, then hike back down to the car. Milt went on to Lake Helen to let Carl know that they were going to have to try and reach the summit some other time. When Milt arrived at Lake Helen, he was met by about 24 campsites that had been set up around the lake. He spotted a ranger and asked him if another older man had come through earlier that morning. The ranger replied that only one other man had, and he had taken the casual trail toward the summit. Milt went after the unknown man, just in case it was Carl. At one point, he got within 100 feet of him, but the man was moving at too fast a pace for Milt, and he was forced to give up. Milt thought that the hiker was going far too fast for it to be Carl anyway, so Milt headed back down the trail to Lake Helen and spoke to the ranger again, who informed him that nobody matching Carl's description had come through. Deciding that Carl must have gone back to 50-50 and they had just missed each other, Milt headed back down the trail where they had set up camp the previous night. Carl, however, was not at 50-50, and there was a new group of hikers setting up camp. He spoke to them and got the time. It was about 5 p.m. Milt was at a loss of what to do, but decided to wait an hour to see if Carl would return. When he didn't, Milt left Carl's pack at 50-50 and descended to where Barry's car was parked. He made it there around 7 or 8 p.m. Once there, Barry and Milt notified the sheriff of Carl's disappearance, and a search would begin the next day. As the search base was getting set up, Barry called Carl's wife, Bobby, to let her know that Carl was missing. She stated that she had a premonition that something like this would happen. Later that same day, a mutual friend would bring Bobby out to the area. Barry and Milt searched alongside the professional search and rescue team. They went up to 50-50 and saw that Carl's pack was still there, untouched. The ranger at Lake Helen once again confirmed that he didn't see anybody matching Carl's description. Search and rescue sent professional climbers to the summit of Mount Shasta, then had them descend using various different routes. Nobody found Carl, nor his ice axe or other gear. There were between 50 to 100 people on the mountain at the time, and none of them reported seeing Carl either. He had vanished. Milt was so distressed by Carl going missing that he ended up consulting 3 psychics for answers. One said that he was in a crevasse, another said that he was in a body of water, and the third stated that it would be many years before he was found. To Milt's knowledge, there were no large crevasses in the area where Carl was hiking. There were a few large holes near trees, but nowhere even to really hide. Carl is still a missing person. In the summary section, Paulides talks about his opportunity that he had to interview the lead of the search and rescue team, Grizz Adams, years later. Grizz stated that out of hundreds of other cases that he had, only 2 had never been found, with Carl being one of them. Grizz stated that there was simply no place for Carl to disappear. The landscape would not have supported somebody being able to disappear completely. He also stated that it was odd that none of his gear was found, since distressed people often shed the gear that they don't want to carry anymore. I'm often accused of misrepresenting the weight that Paulides puts onto supernatural explanations for disappearances, so I will read this section directly in its entirety. Quote, according to local legend, beings called Lemurians live underneath Mount Shasta. I heard from people close to this case that maybe the Lemurians got Carl. I was not sure if the people were joking or serious. Close quote. For context, the legend of Lemuria is basically a sort of Atlantis story. A super advanced society moves underground and now lives underneath Mount Shasta. Let's review the case's main points as discussed in the Missing 411 book. Carl, who was 69 years old at the time, went missing on May 25th, 1999 from Mount Shasta. He went hiking there with 2 friends, Barry and Milt, to climb the mountain. Carl was sick from his altitude medication. On the 25th, he seemed cold and was staring off into space. Milt told Carl to head up the couple hundred feet to Lake Helen alone. Barry turned around about halfway to Lake Helen. Milt chased a hiker, but he was too fast to beat Carl. The ranger didn't see Carl, nor did anyone else. Carl was reported missing that night around 8 p.m. The gear that Carl had with him was never found. Carl himself was never found. And psychics gave 3 different answers about Carl. Please keep these points in mind. We will be addressing each of them and determine if they are accurate statements given the evidence that we're able to dig up. The sources that I use will be cited in the description below. I encourage you to check them out and do your own research, and not take anything that I, or anyone else, say at face value. Before we begin the review of my research in earnest, I want to note that every single case that I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for that was investigated by the Siskiyou County Sheriff got blanketly denied due to the cases being ongoing. Mount Shasta is not the sort of hiking that I personally think about when I conjure up images of hiking on a mountain. Bunny Flat, where Carl, Milton, and Barry would start from, is more along the lines of the traditional side of hiking, where there's a trail that goes up to the cabin, which is a tourist location for hikers. The trail after that becomes narrow, steep, and much more rocky. The trees don't grow much past this point either, which means that you're exposed to the elements as you approach the hiking destination called 50/50. 50/50 is where you can get an incredible vista of the area. There are a couple of places that have stacked rocks to help form little walls for you to shelter if you choose to camp there. The majority of hikers, however, prefer to go further up to a landmark called Lake Helen. Again, this is not a typical lake in a national forest acting as a popular campground for vacationing families. This is a difficult hike, practically a climb, to get to. In May, this area is completely snowed over, and you're expected to clear a flat spot in the snow for you to set up your tent and melt ice and snow for your water. Staying in your tent while you're here is a common practice since there's not much else to do, and it's so exposed on the side of the mountain that it's unwise to expose yourself to the sun, wind, and cold by being outside of your tent. Typically, people start the climb up to the summit from Lake Helen before the sun comes up the next day. I was not able to find any additional information regarding the background of Carl. None of the articles that I was able to find match the same level of detail that Missing 411 has. As such, take the version that I tell with a grain of salt. It appears as though Missing 411 has a source that I wasn't able to get. On Saturday, May 22nd, 1999, Milton Gaines, Barry Gilmore, and Carl Landers were in the process of hiking up Mount Shasta. They had camped about halfway between Horse Camp and Lake Helen the night before, and were supposed to head for the summit that day. However, Carl wasn't feeling well that morning and felt that he would be slower than the other 2 men. He asked if he could go ahead of them at about 9 a.m. so that he could get a head start, to which the other men agreed. After all, the trail from 50/50 to Lake Helen is a hard journey. It's barren, so there's no shelter from the wind. It's steep, and it is rocky. From 50/50 to Lake Helen, it's a climb of about 3/4 of a mile, and it is steeper than any other part of the hike up until this point. You gain more than 1,000 feet in elevation over the 3/4 of a mile. Sometime later, Barry and Milton set out to follow Carl. They were unable to find him, however, and decided the best course of action would be to go back down the mountain and get some help. That night, an ambulance aircraft, as well as California Highway State Patrol, searched, but to no avail. Storms hampered the search. Rain made it difficult for things on the ground, and the cloud cover made it hard for aircraft. There was an unusual addition of lightning strikes that ignited a number of small fires on the other side of Mount Shasta that diverted much of the personnel that were searching to go help with the fires. Several additional aircraft were being used, including ones equipped with infrared cameras. However, this didn't turn up anything either. There was hope that he'd be found alive, even several days after he'd gone missing. The Record Searchlight from May 30th reports that he would have plenty of water and would have had food with him when he went missing. The search was called off on the evening of Monday, May 31st. Carl was never found. I'm a little confused by the differences I see between Missing 411 and the articles and websites that I have access to. For instance, Missing 411 and NamUs both indicate that Carl went missing on the 25th. However, the Charlie Project and articles at the time indicate the 22nd. Some directly stating the 22nd and others stating that he was missing for a week on articles dated on the 29th. That said, even the Siskiyou County Sheriff missing poster has the 25th as the date. I'm not sure which is correct, and I'm even less sure if it really matters that much, but it's odd to me that there's such a conflict around even what day it was. Given that there were articles published as early as the 26th talking about him being last seen on Saturday, which would have been the 22nd, I'm inclined to believe that that's the actual date when he went missing. Another oddity regarding time, besides the actual date, are the various times quoted in the book. The three men got up at an unknown time, stayed in their sleeping bags for several hours to wait out the weather, then Carl went ahead. Milton and Barry followed within 30 minutes. However, Milton didn't make it back to 50/50 after looking for Carl until 5 p.m. He then hiked all the way back to his vehicle and got there between 7 and 8 p.m. My question is, if Carl did leave at 9 a.m., as the Charlie Project and some other articles indicate, and Milton did follow less than 30 minutes later, where did the nearly 8 hours go between Milton last seeing Carl and him making it back to 50/50? I'm not saying that he couldn't have searched for that long. I'm just surprised if he did. That's a long time to search for somebody all on your own, and to not ask the ranger to call it in, especially since this isn't exactly a wooded area. There are huge sight lines where the only place that's out of sight is what's over a ridge or under the snow or in a crevasse. The only theory put forward by Milton and Barry to the newspapers is that perhaps Carl became disoriented and wandered off the trail and then either got lost or fell into a crevasse. Given that he was sick at the time, this would fit nicely with the idea that he most likely would have been dehydrated from his condition, which itself can cause disorientation. To me, though, ultimately the timeline is very odd. And so is the idea that Carl was sick but decided to go on alone rather than wait, only to then have Barry get sick shortly thereafter and turn around himself. It's strange. It's even more strange when you consider how climbing the summit is typically done. Normally, you would hike up to Lake Helen, stay the night, then hike up to the summit when it's still dark around 2 a.m., and then slide down to Lake Helen again to pack up and hike out. If they didn't get started hiking up the mountain again until 9 a.m. or later, I'm not sure how they expected to make it to the summit. I've never been there though, so maybe it's more common to do that than I'm led to believe. Let's look at Missing 411's conclusions and see if they're still valid given my research. Carl, who was 69 years old at the time, went missing on May 25th or May 22nd, 1999. He went with two friends, Milton and Barry. I never saw Milton referred to as Milt, but I do concede that that could be his nickname. Carl was sick. I'm not sure if this was due to medication or not. I did not see any reports that he was staring off into space. Rather, he stated that he just wasn't feeling well and wanted to get a head start, so he went on before his companions. The journey is not just a couple hundred feet. It's 3/4 of a mile up a steep, exposed incline. It is a taxing hike. That said, the sightlines should be mostly clear. I believe it takes around 1 or 2 hours to get from 50/50 to Lake Helen. Barry did turn back because he wasn't feeling well. I don't see any reports about Milton talking to a ranger, chasing a hiker, or what time he reported Carl missing, besides that it was in the evening. Carl's gear that he had on him, nor Carl were ever found. That said, I'm not sure how much gear Carl would have had with him at the time. He left his pack behind and was only planning on going up to Lake Helen and then potentially turning around and coming back. I didn't see any comments about psychics, but surprise, surprise, they're still worthless and give conflicting information. Due to the extra detail thrown in by Missing 411, I'm assuming that Paulides has access to more documents than I was able to obtain. As such, most of the information he provides seems to be pretty solid. I can't really contradict most of it. The only real problem I have with this case as presented is that he makes it sound like Carl was only a couple hundred feet away, but that's not the case. He was up to several thousand feet away, nearly a mile. I do say, though, that this is still an odd case. It's a weird place to go missing when its visibility should be so good. However, if there was enough significant weather around, especially if it was blowing up the snow or raining, I can see that very negatively affecting hikers and your sense of direction. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons over at patreon.com for their very generous support that allows me to continue making these videos. In particular, I'd like to thank those of the public recognition tier, which include the anonymous user, you know who you are, thank you, as well as Nigel B. So thank you, patrons, and thank you for watching. Until next time, take care.